Jimmy Kimmel made a joke on live television, expecting a laugh. But Jasmine Crockett's composed reply left him silent and the audience captivated. The cameras were already rolling when Jasmine stepped onto the set, confident, unfazed. She wore black heels, a bold emerald blazer, and her hair in a tight bun that didn't budge. She shook Jimmy's hand, smiled politely, and took her seat across from him as the crowd applauded, energized more by routine than excitement. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, sporting the playful grin he reserved for when politicians visited. "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, everyone," he said. "The firecracker from Dallas, or maybe the one-woman filibuster." Jasmine gave a brief chuckle, the kind that says she's heard it all before. "You can call me Jasmine," she replied, her voice smooth and warm. "But I'm no one's firecracker." The audience laughed, but it was a tentative laugh, unsure of who the joke was actually aimed at. The opening minutes followed the usual late-night format. Jimmy made jokes about Congress and political drama. Jasmine responded with grace, mixing thoughtful answers with a few sharp, subtle jabs. Then Jimmy pulled out a note card and the tone shifted slightly. "So, Jasmine," he said, leaning in with a smile, "you're known for being, how should I say it, kind of spicy. Is that a tactic, or are you just ready to throw down the moment you wake up?" A few chuckles echoed from the crowd. Jasmine tilted her head, analyzing him. Jimmy continued, "It's like you're auditioning for a Real Housewives spin-off, The Hill Wives of Capitol Hill." The laughter was louder this time, but there was a pause beforehand, just long enough to signal something had changed. Jasmine didn't laugh. She calmly picked up her mug, sipped, and set it back down. "I'll answer that," she said. "But first, let me ask you something." Jimmy raised his eyebrows, intrigued. "Do you ever get tired of white men calling you spicy just because you won't let them talk over you?" Silence. But not the kind that follows a bad joke. This was different. People blinked. A few made that involuntary sound that escapes when something lands too sharply to ignore. Jimmy leaned back, speechless for the first time. Jasmine didn't flinch. She just looked at him, steady, unfazed, like she'd been here before. Something had shifted, not tension but focus. Even those half glancing at their phones were now fully engaged. Jimmy laughed nervously, trying to reset the mood. "Okay, I walked into that one." "No," Jasmine replied, "you ran." But this time the audience didn't laugh like before, and neither did Jimmy. He tapped his cue cards against the desk, a habit he had when needing to reset, but now, it wasn't just nerves. He seemed genuinely thrown off, as if the script had slipped from his hands. "Well," he muttered, "this is already more interesting than the guy who writes fortune cookies." A few light laughs. Jasmine sat, legs crossed, hands folded, silent. She didn't need to say anything else. Jimmy pressed on, clearly hoping to steer the conversation back. "You've been very outspoken about, well, nearly everything. Some folks call you bold, others say you're angry. How would you describe it?" Jasmine looked at him directly. "Truthful." Jimmy opened his mouth but didn't respond. The energy had changed. No longer a performance, but a real conversation. "Sure, truthful is good," Jimmy chuckled awkwardly. "But you've definitely had some fiery moments. You ever ask Senator Kennedy that?" she asked evenly. "Or, is being heated only a problem when it's a woman?" Jimmy blinked again. His grin faltered. I think we have a clip." "Don't," she said, cutting in, voice calm. "Not unless you're showing everyone else losing their cool too. Otherwise, you're not showing the truth. You're selling a version." A murmur passed through the room. Someone clapped, then stopped when no one joined in. Jimmy cleared his throat. "Look, Jasmine, I wasn't trying to—" "I know," she said, her tone softening. "But you are. That's the problem. It's built into how this space works." She leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with him. "I come here as myself, unfiltered, real. And the first thing I get called is spicy." Jimmy looked like he had something to say, but Jasmine held his gaze. "What you're really saying is, I don't behave like the people you're used to seeing on this couch. But maybe that's not my problem. Maybe that's yours. The pause that followed was heavier than before. Even the band stayed silent. Jimmy finally looked down and nodded. Fair enough. Jasmine leaned back. That's all I wanted. For a few seconds, that was it. No jokes, no flashy lines. Just two people on camera in a moment that didn't feel scripted. It felt honest. Maybe even a bit uncomfortable. Jimmy wasn't ready to end on that note. All right, he said, flashing a smile that didn't fully land. Let's talk about something lighter. You brought your dog, right? I heard he peed on Capitol grounds and made headlines. That cracked the tension. The audience laughed, really laughed this time. Jasmine allowed herself a small smirk. He's got better instincts than some of my colleagues. And just like that, the energy lifted, if only slightly. But the shift had already happened, and no one in that room could deny it. Even though the mood lightened, the earlier moments still lingered. The cameras continued rolling, but the room didn't fully return to its original rhythm. Jimmy leaned on humor to guide the show forward, but his timing was off. You could sense. He felt it too. Jasmine, however, appeared perfectly composed, as if she'd been in this chair countless times, even if this was her first. So, Jimmy said, shuffling through his note cards. We've talked politics. You've checked me a few times. I'm still recovering, I think. But let's talk about what's next. Congresswoman today, but tomorrow, Senate, White House, Netflix special. That last part was meant as a joke, but it landed awkwardly. Jasmine chuckled lightly, though something sharp flickered behind her smile. Funny thing about the future, she said. Everyone seems to think they know yours better than you do. Jimmy paused. Meaning? I mean, she continued, every time I walk into a room like this, someone's already writing my story before I've said a word. People like to skip to the ending, especially when it's someone like me. He raised an eyebrow. Someone like you? Black, female, loud when I need to be, quiet when that makes others uncomfortable, smart enough to make a few folks feel like they have something to prove. The room fell quiet again, not out of discomfort but out of attention. Everyone was listening, trying to catch the weight of what she said without needing a punchline. Jimmy gave it another try. You've had a few viral moments already. That oversight committee exchange, the press conference where you shut down that reporter from Dallas. Is this how you want to be seen? As someone who claps back? Jasmine leaned forward, ready now. Jimmy, when you grow up being told you have to be twice as good and still get called twice as difficult, you learn to choose your words carefully. So if one of those words breaks through the noise, it's not about being viral. It's about being heard. That line hit like a bell strike, clear, undeniable. Jimmy's eyes widened slightly, not offended, but as though something just clicked. For him, the audience didn't clap, they didn't need to. They were locked in, not in admiration, but in recognition. I'm not trying to be a meme, she added, but if one sentence makes people stop and think, even for a moment, then maybe I said what needed saying. Jimmy didn't speak right. Away. Instead, he turned his cue card over, laid it flat on the desk. Well, he said quietly, you said it. There was a beat of stillness. Then from the back of the room, a single clap. A few others joined in. It wasn't thunderous, not yet, but it was enough to shift the room again. Jimmy looked toward the camera, a bit more reflective than he'd been at the start. We'll be right back, he said. As the screen faded to commercial, no one moved. A few crew members whispered. A producer gestured to someone off stage. Jimmy sat still, blinking slowly, lips pressed tight, like he was replaying everything in his mind. Jasmine reached for her water again, still calm, centered, like she hadn't just upended a late-night studio with a few firm, clear sentences. But what had happened in that moment wouldn't stay in that studio. When the show returned from break, something felt off. Not wrong, just unsure. The applause came, but it lacked the usual bounce. Some in the crowd looked uncertain, like they weren't sure if this was still a talk show or something else altogether. Jimmy tried to regain footing. We're back with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, he said, who just casually took Over my own show. It was a decent line. He smiled widely, hoping for a safe laugh. Jasmine offered a polite grin. Just doing my civic duty. This time the laughter came a little easier, relieved even. But the air between them had shifted. You could see it in Jimmy's posture. He sat straighter now, no longer leaning in so much. He wasn't rattled, just more aware. Aware that something bigger had happened. So, tell me, he continued, voice lighter now. What's something? People always get wrong about you? Jasmine didn't hesitate. That I came here to play nice. The crowd laughed, genuinely this time. Not because the line was clever, but because it was honest. And when honesty lands on TV, the reaction isn't just laughter, it's release. Jimmy nodded. Fair enough, I'll say this. I might not agree with everything you say, but I definitely wouldn't want to debate you without a lifeline and a couple of assistants. That line actually landed. The audience roared. Even Jasmine laughed, for real, the first time during the entire interview. And just like that, some of the tension finally broke. They spent the next few minutes discussing her community work, the district she represents in Dallas, and the legislation she's been championing, particularly around mental health resources in underserved communities. It wasn't fluff, but it was safer ground. The kind of content designed for social media clips, unlikely to spark backlash. Still, you could feel it. Beneath every exchange was that earlier moment, echoing. No one had forgotten it. You couldn't unhear it, and you couldn't pretend it hadn't shifted the conversation. In the final stretch of the segment, Jimmy did something rare. He spoke with real appreciation. Look, Jasmine, he said. Whatever people think about politics, I think it's obvious. You're not afraid to be exactly who you are. And I respect that, even when it throws me off a little. Without missing a beat, Jasmine responded, Growth starts at discomfort. Jimmy chuckled. I'll be quoting that all week. They stood to shake hands, and then something unexpected happened. The audience rose to their feet, not on cue, no signal from the floor, just a quiet, collective decision. One by one they stood. Some clapped. A few held their hands to their mouths. Others lifted phones to capture the moment. Jimmy looked surprised. Jasmine almost amused. Thank y'all, she said into the mic, then walked off stage. The credits rolled over a wide shot of the still-standing audience. The band played softly, but even their music seemed to tread lightly, not wanting to interrupt what had just taken place. Backstage, a different kind of energy took over. Producers whispered in corners. A makeup artist glanced at her phone repeatedly, wide-eyed. A young staffer with a headset leaned to a colleague and whispered, We're already trending. Jimmy stood by a monitor, watching a playback of the interview. He wasn't speaking, just quietly taking in the moment when Jasmine had asked him, Do you ever get tired of white guys calling you spicy? He turned to the executive producer beside him. You think I went too far? The producer didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, I think you poked someone who's used to fighting with a mic in one hand and her dignity in the other. Jimmy sighed. Yeah. And I had cue cards. While Jimmy tried to process what had just unfolded in the studio, the outside world had already begun reacting. Fast. Before he even wrapped the post-show segment and Jasmine's car left the lot, the internet was already ignited. The clip hit X, formerly known as Twitter, within 20 minutes. A shaky phone video from an audience member circulated with the caption, She didn't even raise her voice. Jasmine Crockett just folded Kimmel in real time. It pulled over 300,000 views in under an hour. Then came the TikToks, dramatic soundtracks, split-screen reactions. One user, a Politico baddie, posted, I've watched this 12 times, the way she said, Maybe that's not my problem, maybe that's yours. That's going to live rent-free in my brain. The comments exploded. Some celebrated. Finally, someone said it. Others pushed back. It was a joke, get over it. But most agreed. Something real had happened. By midnight, a bootleg version of the interview surfaced on YouTube, cleaned up, subtitled, already climbing views. By the next morning, it had become the most watched video across the platform. And it wasn't just political circles or late-night fans talking. It had spread to group chats, Facebook feeds, and morning talk shows. On The View, Ana Navarro weighed in. "I've been in green rooms with Jasmine Crockett. That woman's not here to play checkers." Over on ESPN, Stephen A. Smith mentioned it on his podcast. Maybe it was political, but to me, that was someone taking a verbal elbow and sending it back without ever standing up. Local radio, stations, even ones in places like Flagstaff and Bakersfield, were referencing it between traffic and weather updates. But not all the attention was supportive. Some conservative pundits latched onto the moment, trying to spin it as another angry Democrat woman having a meltdown on live TV. They called it disrespectful, inappropriate, and unprofessional. The thing is, Jasmine hadn't been disrespectful. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't insulted anyone. She hadn't even shifted her tone. And that's what made the moment resonate. It wasn't loud, it was firm, it wasn't flashy, it was focused. And people couldn't stop replaying the silence that followed, the way Jimmy stumbled, the way the laughter turned into reflection. By lunchtime, her communications team was fielding calls from major outlets: CNN, MSNBC, NPR. Even 60 Minutes left a message about a possible sit-down. Her communications director, Andre, a thin, sharp guy with fast fingers, just shook his head as the inquiries piled in. "Do we even respond?" someone asked. Jasmine looked up from her phone. "We don't need to." "Not even a tweet?" She smiled. "Let them talk. I already said what I needed to say." That quote became a headline on its own. Jasmine Crockett responds to viral interview. "I already said what I needed to say." Support came in from corners of the internet that rarely agreed on anything. Young organizers praised her precision. Older voters admired her restraint. Even a few celebrities chimed in. Ava DuVernay called her unshakable. Kerry Washington reposted the clip with a single word: respect. Jimmy Kimmel's team eventually released a quiet statement through a spokesperson. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't a defense either. Just a brief message saying he appreciated Jasmine's honesty and believed in tough, honest dialogue. Some said it was weak. Others thought it was enough. But while the internet kept dissecting the moment, there was a deeper story behind why that sentence, "Maybe that's not my problem. Maybe that's yours," landed the way it did. Before there were headlines and hashtags, before viral clips and late-night tension, there was a girl in East Dallas sitting in the back of a classroom, raising her hand too often. Jasmine Crockett was that kid, the one who asked questions the teacher didn't want to answer, the one called difficult for wondering why the library had outdated books or why they never learned about people who looked like her. Her mom worked nights as a nurse. Her dad ran a small auto shop. They didn't have a lot, but they had just enough to give Jasmine stability and self-worth. What they didn't have was extra time. So Jasmine learned to stand her ground early, not by being loud, but by being precise. If you tried to box her in, she'd ask who built the box and why it only fit one kind of voice. At Prairie View A&M, she studied political science, worked at the help desk, and spent weekends at debate competitions, often facing students with more resources and polish. But Jasmine had something deeper. Not a quick burn, but a slow, steady flame that never dimmed. Law school refined her focus. Working in public defense showed her injustice without headlines. She sat across from mothers in courtrooms that barely listened, typed motions on a creaky laptop in her small apartment, stayed up late while her fridge hummed beside her. Every time she argued a case, someone labeled her aggressive. Every time she made a point, she was called too passionate. Every time she stood her ground, she was told she'd get further if she just smiled more. She kept receipts, not just of what people said, but how it made her feel. How each label was meant to shrink her, reduce her to something easier to dismiss. So when Jimmy Kimmel called her spicy, it wasn't just about that comment. It was about all the years she had spent unlearning the idea that she had to tone herself down to be taken seriously. That's why her response, "Maybe that's not my problem, maybe that's yours," landed with so much force. Because people like Jasmine have always been expected to adjust, to soften their words, to carry the burden of making everyone else comfortable. But she wasn't interested in adjusting anymore. She was interested in being accurate, in showing grace, and in reminding everyone that correcting someone doesn't have to mean tearing them down. That's what the audience respected. That's why the moment stuck. Because Jasmine didn't clap back, she stood firm, not to be loud, but to be heard. Andre, her communications director, summed it up best later that night in a text to a friend. She didn't come here to trend. She came to remind folks why they listen in the first place. And that's what stayed with people. Not the tension, not the applause, not even the awkward jokes. Just the truth. But as the internet noise began to quiet down and the trending charts moved on to the next thing, one final moment brought everything full circle. And it didn't happen in front of a camera. It happened 2 days later in a quiet, backstage hallway at the El Capitan Theater in Hollywood. Jimmy Kimmel was back on set, prepping for the evening taping. Crew moved around setting lights, testing audio, and reviewing the show rundown. The viral buzz had started to fade, but something still hung over the studio, something that hadn't been resolved. Jasmine Crockett returned, not as a guest, but for a meeting with one of the producers about a new initiative she was supporting, one focused on media literacy and political education for underserved schools. She hadn't expected to run into Jimmy, but fate or simple logistics had other plans. They crossed paths near the dressing rooms. He spotted her first. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure. Then he stepped forward. "Hey," he said quietly. Jasmine looked up, not surprised, not defensive, just present. "Hey." There was a pause. You could tell he was thinking through his words, not to say the perfect thing, but to make it count. "I've been thinking about what you said that night," he began. Jasmine nodded slightly. He continued. "I think I got a little too comfortable. Forgot that being funny doesn't excuse being careless." She tilted her head, studying him. "You're not the first," she said calmly. "And you won't be the last." "I know," he replied, "but I don't want to be either." There was a quiet beat between them. Then Jasmine's tone softened. "Then don't be." Jimmy let out a breath, like someone who hadn't realized he'd been holding it. "Thanks for not torching me," he said. Jasmine smirked. "I don't torch, I clarify." He laughed, genuinely this time. The hallway, the lighting, the entire atmosphere felt lighter now. And that moment, no one recorded it. There were no camera phones, no applause, no dramatic editing. But it mattered. Because real growth, the kind that sticks, doesn't always play out on a stage. Sometimes it's two people meeting halfway without scripts, just honesty. Later, that same week, Jasmine gave a talk at a high school in Tulsa. During the Q&A, a student raised her hand and asked, "How do you stay calm when people try to make you feel small?" Jasmine didn't pause. "You don't give them the power to define you," she said. "And you remember, there's nothing louder than grace." That quote made it into the school's weekly newsletter. A teacher printed it out and pinned it to the classroom wall. And maybe that's what this entire story was really about. Because standing your ground doesn't always mean raising your voice. Sometimes it means knowing exactly who you are when someone tries to reduce you to a soundbite. It means letting your words carry weight. Not because you shout, but because you mean them. Jasmine Crockett didn't win a debate that night. She didn't destroy her host. What she did was make room for herself and for every person who's ever been mislabeled before they got a chance to speak. She showed that you don't have to be loud to be strong. You don't have to be soft to be respected. And you don't have to fight dirty to make your point. Because sometimes one sentence, delivered clearly and calmly, can shift a room more than any performance ever could. And if you felt something listening to this story, if it made you think, pause, or reflect, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, speak up, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because stories like this aren't just about entertainment, they're reminders, and we need more of them.